I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today because I have with me in the studio, my, it's a studio, right? Yeah. I have with me in the studio Randy Rubenstein from SRA Solder. I did an interview with Randy some months ago, and you might guess from the name SRA Solder, they do soldering supplies, soldering irons, solder, etc., all that stuff. And he is a bona fide expert at soldering. So I was really happy to do that interview with him. I think it's one of the best videos I have on soldering. And I really think that's a topic that we in the hobby need to study more because let's face it, a lot of you guys out there aren't very good at soldering. There's no shame in it. Don't be embarrassed. You do your best. You just want to fly the freaking quadcopter, but if you can't solder, you're not going to get good results out of your quadcopter. And yes, you ask me questions about why it's not working right, and when I finally see a photo of your board, I'm like, yeah, you don't know how to solder. So this is an area we can all stand to learn a lot more about, and that's why I'm really glad that Randy is here. Now, I did an interview with Randy where we covered a lot of the basic stuff, and I highly recommend that you go check that one out as well after you're done watching this one, of course. But there were some questions you guys raised, and I'm very glad to have him back to try to address some of those questions. Randy, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Joshua. Good to see you. Good to hear from you again.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're here, actually, you're not just here because you love people asking you questions about soldering, but you're also here because maybe you were inspired by our last video, I don't know, but SRA is actually starting its own YouTube channel. Is that right?
That is correct. It should be going live in the next couple of days. We're going to have all kinds of how-to videos, how to solder, how to remove chips from a board, things like that.
And actually, by the time you guys are watching this video, that channel should be live. So I'm going to make sure that and there's a link to it down in the video description if you want to go check that out. And I really enjoyed our first interview so much. You had so much to offer, so I'm sure that all these tutorials and stuff are going to be very, very helpful as well. But for the time being, let's get to some of these questions that were raised after our last video and some topics that we didn't get to. And in our last video, one of the things we talked about was the temperature at which you want to solder. And just to make sure we set the record straight, I think there was a little bit of a flub on that one. We've corrected it in the video description and in the comments, but in case anybody watched that first video and didn't get the correction, what's the recommended temperature for, just a starting point for general purpose soldering?
So in centigrade, I usually like to go between, say, 315 and 350 centigrade.
Mm-hmm.
Much higher, you're going to start oxidizing your tips and reducing the life of those. Much lower than that, you're going to end up with taking a long time and end up with not a great solder joint.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the range. It really depends on your wattage. If you have a high wattage iron, you could probably use a little less temperature, where a low wattage iron takes longer to recover. And by recover, I mean, so you take the iron and put it against your board or your wires you're trying to solder, its tip temperature is going to drop. So a low wattage is going to take longer to get back to where you want to be, say at 350.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the difference between a high wattage and a low wattage iron is the recovery time.
And you're assuming there, I think, that you're using the 6337 eutectic solder, not the 6040 that some people are using. Is that right?
You could use the same temperature range for both the solders.
I've had
Do you want to use? Yeah, go ahead.
I've had some people tell me that they took one of the pieces of advice we gave in that first video is that pretty much everybody should be using the 6337, not the 6040. And if you want to hear more about that, you go watch that video. We're not going to dive into it here, but I've had some people tell me that since they started using the 6337 because it has a lower melting point, that they're able to use lower temperatures.
That's correct. You can go a little bit lower. The 6337 is called eutectic, which means its liquidus and solidus temperature are the same, versus 6040. The liquidus temperature is different than the solidus, but they're still within probably 30 degrees of each other.
Okay. Now, here's a question that I had after I took your advice and I started trying to use lower temperature. And just for your perspective, I have my iron set in Fahrenheit, but I typically use about 750, which I think is about 400 centigrade, more or less.
Yes, that's correct.
And I tried lowering it down to closer to what you were saying. I think I moved down to like 600, 625. And I just found that it's hard for me to quantify what I didn't like. I didn't find that I was getting very good results. It felt like I had to apply the iron longer, and it was harder for me to get good joints. And I don't know. Do you have any? I don't know. Any thoughts about that? Why didn't I
What
seem to get good
what
results?
wattage? What wattage was your iron?
So it's a Hacko 888D. So I think it's a 60-watt iron, but
60 watt. Okay.
yeah, it's a Hacko 888D. So I don't think the iron is to blame here. I don't know. Any thoughts?
Then we can blame you, I guess, Josh,
I'll
instead of the
take
iron.
I'll take the blame. I mean, well, I guess what I'm getting at is what things might I be doing to not get good results, or what things should I be doing? Obviously, it's kind of open ended, just making you guess here.
Right. So if you're soldering a board or soldering wires.
So typically soldering wires to a board,
Okay.
22 gauge up to maybe as high as 12 gauge. But even on the smaller gauge wires, it just kind of felt like I was in and out faster and got better sort of flow on the solder by using the higher temperature. I didn't get bad results with the lower temperature. It just kind of took longer to finish the joint. I was like, well, why not just run at a hotter temperature and get in and out faster? Maybe that's the question.
Right. Yeah, that's it's actually a very good question point you bring up, because soldering wires is different than just soldering chips on a board. Chips on a board, you don't have too much to draw heat away from the joint, whereas you're soldering a wire, that heat is going to start traveling up the wire and absorbing some of the heat that you're trying to put on the solder joint. So in the case of wires, it's not a problem to raise the temperature to a higher amount, like 400 C. If you're doing wires, depending on how thin they are, maybe a 28, 30 gauge won't need that, but you get to 22 or 18 gauge, you probably do need a higher iron temperature to get a better flow and
I see.
faster. So it's really a function of what you're soldering, and the wires will absorb the heat and kind of pull the heat away from the joint.
As opposed to doing something well, certainly SMD, although not many people are doing surface mount by hand, although it can be done. But like doing maybe through-hole chips onto a board, or through-hole legs, through-hole components like that.
Correct. You could use a much lower temperature than for wires, because you got a small pad and you got a small leg on the IC.
I see.
So it doesn't draw away too much heat.
I see.
So
That's
what you were seeing is the wire was pulling the heat away and it was taking longer to
okay.
solder.
So, and I think that's probably true for most people in this particular branch of the hobby. Not a lot of us are soldering components to boards so much as we are soldering wires to boards, and maybe then the additional thermal mass of the wire is going to mean, especially if you're doing larger wires like ESC wires, which might be 18 or 20 gauge, or main battery leads where we're up to something like 12 or 14 gauge, you're going to need a higher temperature just to sort of get the heat into the wire quickly enough to make the joint work.
Right. And also with a higher wattage iron versus a lower wattage iron, if you're doing wires or any heavy gauge wire, you want to have a higher wattage temperature. So all the heat is lost. That's lost. The iron can pump it back into the solder joint that you're working on.
Right. Now, there's something that we sort of touched. We didn't touch on it so much as we brushed up against it, maybe, and that is the question of wicking. So a thing that people asked about was that if you're trying to solder the wire, and when you're finished, a lot of the solder has wicked up into the wire, and the way this will manifest, if you guys don't know what I'm talking about, is that when you're done, there will be a stiff part of the wire, maybe 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 inch even up past where the joint is, where the solder has sort of, well, it's wicked up into the wire and solidified. And that's not good. Why is that? First of all, why is that bad, Randy?
It's actually not bad unless it's a problem in your application. You're trying to bend that wire to get it into a certain shape. As long as you've got a good solid joint, let's say you twisted the wires together, you're not doing like a butt joint. It's okay if the solder flows into the strands of the wire, because that makes the bond stronger.
Oh, okay.
The only problem is if you're trying to bend that into a small shape, or it becomes difficult for you to maneuver that wire where you want it to be inside the board of the copter, then it can be a problem for that application.
Yeah, so a place where that might, so there's nothing fundamentally wrong with it as long as you're okay with the wire being where it is what you're saying?
Correct. Yep.
And a place we might run into that is if you're doing, especially with like a 4-in-1 ESC, where the wires are hanging off the edge of the board, a lot of times they'll be coming out the side of the quad. Well, you don't want them hanging out too much past the side of the quad because it increases the odds that they might get nicked or something. But for example, it sounds like if you were to bend them downward at like a 90-degree angle, and then if the solder were to wick up into them and harden them at that angle, as long as you're okay with that angle, maybe that's not such a big deal. What can you do to minimize this wicking if you do desire to minimize it?
So you could use a 60-40 solder, which will minimize that wicking because it doesn't flow as much as a 6337. You could also use some of the lead-free solders, which also don't wick as much as the 6337, like a tin silver, like a 96.5 tin, 3.5 silver, if you want to do that. So some of those solders will not spread as much as the 6337. So
Although
that would be
it's going to make it more challenging. I mean, I winced a little bit when you said you could use a lead-free solder because some people out there are using. That's another tip from our first video that is certainly bears repeating. The majority of home hobbyists should not be using lead-free. It's harder to solder. It has very few advantages, but it sounds like this is one advantage at least if you're up to getting a good joint out of it.
right. The other advantage of the lead-free, it is stronger than a tin lead, because it's got some silver in it, say 3.5% silver. It makes it stronger, but you got to it melt at a much higher temperature. It's a lot more expensive. So
Yeah.
if you have some lying around, you could use it, but you really don't need to go out and buy it, just because of the excess cost. It's usually at least twice the cost of a 6337 or a 6040 solder.
Yeah. The next place I want to go, there's a major topic that we didn't really touch on, and that is tip care. And this is another place, like basic soldering technique, like being at the right temperature, using good solder, using a temperature-controlled iron. These are all things that we touched on in the first video that people need to hear about. But then once you've got the iron, tip care, I think, is another area that people really make a lot of mistakes. So let's start by talking about how do you care for the tip of your iron, and how do you know when the tip of your iron is screwed up and needs to be either reconditioned or replaced?
Okay, it is a good question, a good point. When you're done soldering for the day, it is best to tin the iron with fresh solder. And what that does, the fresh solder will prevent oxidation on the tip from the tip just sitting there, any corrosion. So they have tip tinners on the market. You can just dip the iron into this little tin with a tip tinner, spin it, and it coats your tip, and then you can put it away for a week, a month, or whatever without losing any performance on your tip. So I'd recommend anyone doing that, even when you first put a brand new tip on, tin it. At the end of the day, also tin it. So you can tin it with regular solder. You can tin it with lead-free solder, which most of the tip tinners are, but you should always tin your tip at the end of soldering.
And just to be clear, in case we got any complete rank beginners here, when you say tin the tip, you mean just basically take a little bit of solder and put just a little coating of solder on the tip, and then don't wipe it off, I think is what
Correct.
you mean? Yeah.
Yes. Yep. Leave it on, and that protects the tip. It puts a coating on the tip that will prevent any oxidation or corrosion occurring on the tip.
Now, will the tip degrade? We know that if you run the tip at 850 degrees Fahrenheit, too hot, basically, then it will oxidize and degrade. Will the tip also degrade when it's cold?
It will not degrade when it's cold, typically, as long as it's clean.
Okay.
What can cause a tip to degrade would be some of the fluxes and the flux residues on the tip. If you're using an acid solder flux or sometimes a rosin, just over time having fluxes on the tip can cause it to degrade and potentially corrode over time. So that's why we recommend putting a fresh coat of solder on it, which will protect it.
Okay. So then how can you know when your tip is, like, when it's time to replace the tip or recondition? First, can you recondition a tip? If a tip has become oxidized, is not performing right, can it be reconditioned, or is it just replaceable?
No, it can be reconditioned. There's a product called sal ammoniac, which comes in like a mini bar of soap. And what you can do is a hard block, and you can take your tip, rub it against this bar, and it will remove some oxidation, kind of recondition the tip. So it's a pretty popular product that we sell, and very inexpensive. It's going to last you a lifetime. It doesn't really wear
Right.
out.
Yeah.
So that's one way of really cleaning the tip, removing oxidation. If your tip has corrosion on it, there's really not much you can do but replace the tip.
And what are the signs? Actually, let's back up. What is the effect of having an oxidized tip? What does that do to your ability to solder?
So what happens with the oxidized tip, the solder is not going to stick to your tip. So it's going to make heat transfer difficult if it's oxidized, because the oxidation coating is going to prevent some of the heat transfer, and the solder will not stick to your tip.
And so if you just take your solder, you're not even soldering a joint, but if you just touch the solder to the hot iron tip, and instead of kind of flowing out onto the tip, the solder kind of balls up.
It would ball up, correct.
Yeah, and then it kind of rolls around on the tip and doesn't kind of sort of flow and stick to the tip. That's a sign that your tip may be oxidized. Visually, you also can see like black marks on the tip.
Yeah, it will be darker in color. Usually it should be a shiny silver color, but it will start darkening up as it oxidizes.
Yeah. And so then at that point, it's time for a new tip typically, although you may be able to recondition it because the tips actually, talk a little bit about the construction of a soldering iron tip, because I think people, you just look at it and you go, oh, it's just a piece of metal, right? But it's not, is it?
No, it's not. There's some copper in there, and the tip is actually plated over with tin to give it that silver color. And the way the tip works is the tip will fit, typically it will fit over an element. So there's a hole in the end of the tip where it slides in over the heating element, and then you clamp it down with some type of screw mechanism for most irons. And over time, that connection can loosen up just from wear and tear. Maybe the element is getting worn, and the tip isn't fitting as tightly, so you don't have as good heat transfer. So sometimes it may not be your tip; it could be your element. If you had an element in your iron for a long time, and you've changed tips, and over time you can wear down the element or chip it. So that's another thing to look out for. And they're pretty easy to replace. But you do need a soldering iron in most cases to replace the element, so it's kind of a catch-22.
Yeah, that's one of the things you mentioned about the. I'm sorry. How do you pronounce the name? I can't pronounce it. The irons you sell.
Right. RU the 9378 Pro, which we just introduced several months back, has a plug-in heating replacement, so it makes it much easier to replace.
Yeah, it's the heating element is basically soldered to the tip, and it's a little bit of a catch-22 where you have to desolder the heating element to replace it if you want to do that. But if you don't have a working soldering iron, then you can't do it. And one of the nice things about the soldering irons that you sell is at least just the Pro, the 9378 Pro.
The 937 Plus and the 9378 Pro both have the replaceable element.
Yeah.
Plug-in element.
So if you get a situation where your iron is not really transferring heat, and that's really what soldering is all about, is transferring heat from the iron into the joint to cause the solder to flow. One cause can be that you got the oxidized tip, and usually you'll be able to see the oxides, the dark layer of oxide on the tip. It'll look not shiny. And the other reason is that you might have bad heat transfer between the heating element and the tip, and you might need a new heating element on your iron. It's interesting what you said about the tip being plated, because some people will try to recondition their tip and they'll get out some abrasive, like just maybe sometimes a piece of sandpaper, and they'll just scrape the oxide layer off. But that's not a good idea, is it?
That's probably the worst thing you can do to your tip is sand it to get rid of the oxide coating, because you're going to wear off the tin plating, and you're going to expose the metal underneath it, which is going to oxidize faster than the tin would have.
Right.
So definitely do not do that. And that's why we came up with the salmoniac block, which has been around in the field for a while as a way of reconditioning your tip. Great.
So
do not sand it. Do not grind it. Be gentle with it.
Yeah. Because that tin plating it prevents the oxidation, but it's not very thick. And once you can see copper, your tip it's done. You're just done.
Right, exactly. Throw it
Yeah,
away.
yeah. And the thing is, a tip is not that freaking expensive. A tip is like $10, maybe $12. I don't know. How much are the tips for the irons you sell?
They're $4 for the
Oh,
9378 and the 937.
so you should.
It's almost not worth messing around with it.
No, just if your tip is not shiny and silver, if the solder is balling up instead of flowing smoothly, that's the first thing you should think about doing is getting a new tip. So let's talk then about tips, about because the tips come in a variety of sizes and shapes, and many people are probably still soldering on the tip that came with their iron, but choosing the right size and shape of tip for the joint can actually make a big difference. So what are let's talk about that. What kind of different tips are there in general, and what kind of tips are appropriate for what kind of work?
Right. Okay, so let's talk about this really three major families of tips. There's a conical, which is probably what came with your iron, which is really a round tip.
Like a pencil.
On the end. Like a pencil, exactly. The next category is called a bevel, which has typically a 45 to 60 degree angle. Mm-hmm. So imagine taking your conical tip and cutting it at say a 45 degree angle. That's what a bevel tip looks like.
I'll put some pictures up when I do the post-production so everybody can see what you're talking about.
Yeah. I can send you some of those.
Oh,
so
sure.
The advantage of the bevel is you get more surface area. The more surface area you have on the tip, the more you're going to heat up your parts. So if you're soldering like wire, for example, you'd want to use a bevel tip and probably go as wide as you can on the bevel tip.
And the disadvantage, I think, when I've used those is the bigger bevels are heavier. They have more thermal mass, especially with a weaker iron. I think a bevel can make up a little bit for your weaker iron. Would you agree with that or disagree?
It can be. It's still going to heat up slower because of the extra mass and your lower wattage on your iron. So if I'd recommend anywhere from a 50 to 70 degree watt iron. The cheaper Radio Shack irons that are usually 25 to 35 watts will have trouble with heavier wires and heavier type tips.
Yeah. Way back when I had one of those irons and was struggling to get, especially like maybe a 12 gauge wire, I would put the heavy bevel tip, on it, and then I would just let the iron sit there for 5 minutes and get good and hot, and then I would get in there and I would do one joint, and then the tip would cool down, but I would just barely maybe finish the joint.
Right.
So it's not good practice.
Right, and that gets to recovery time, which we mentioned before. Is as you're putting the tip on some wires, the heat is going to be drawn away from the iron, and it takes a low wattage iron takes a long time to recover to the temperature that you set it to.
Yeah. And then the downside, I think, of the bevel tip is, well, like you say, they're more surface area. So especially in tight environments, you're going to be more likely to accidentally, damage something or get the heat where you want it.
Right. If you're doing something on a board, you got some tight chips around it. You don't want to go real wide on your bevel tip because of that. Because you could easily nick something next to it or heat something else up or remove solder on an adjacent chip. The other type is called a chisel tip. And a chisel tip is kind of angled on both sides.
And we'll put a picture up as well.
And put a picture of that. And doesn't cut the widths on that are smaller than you'd find on a bevel. Sometimes we have some longer tips to get into tighter areas with a chisel tip and still get a flat surface to work with your wires. So really it's a matter of preference and what you like. People should really get an assortment of different types and find out what works best for their application and what they're trying to do.
I personally do almost all of my work with a chisel tip. On the heavier wires, I really should put a bevel tip on, I think. But I just kind of choke up on the barrel of the chisel tip and try to get it done. But I think that it's all about the surface contact with the joint. So on a pencil tip, for example, when you're trying to do wires, the pencil tip is so thin, or the cylindrical tip as you called it, it's so thin that it's really hard to get much surface contact with the joint. And it seems like that I don't even like to use them at all. I mean, maybe when is that one most appropriate?
That works great if you're doing work on a circuit board, removing through-hole components or putting soldering through-hole components on. Surface mount, you can use it with, but some people will use a bevel for a surface mount. So it's a good universal chip, but if you're doing any heavy soldering with wires, you definitely should use a bevel or a chisel type tip.
Good. Let's see.
I'm guessing most people have a conical on their iron. They've probably never tried any other type tip, so that's
if that's true,
worth trying.
I would definitely recommend trying different ones out. Like if somebody was to buy, you could certainly just get there are assortments of tips that you can buy that come in various sizes and shapes. But if you were to pick like just 3 or 4 maybe tips that somebody should try to get a sort of a sense, like not just the shape but also the size, what would you suggest somebody will be looking at?
So like on a chisel chip, I'd recommend like a 1.2 millimeter wide is a good size. It's a popular one. On a bevel tip, let's see, like a 2 millimeter and maybe a 3 millimeter wide tip. And on the chisel, you could also go with a small one, like a 0.8 millimeter is a good choice. And whatever, it's just a matter of preference. Those are kind of some of the popular sizes that we see.
Yeah. And you're going to have to figure out, each one works a little bit differently. So, for example, a trick that I've come up with the bevel tips, if you do need to get in somewhere fine, if you come in with the edge of the bevel tip kind of upside down, you can kind of sometimes sneak the edge of it in somewhere a little bit tighter. Whereas if you're working with a pencil tip or a conical tip, sometimes you got to get in there with the side of it to maybe get a little bit more heat transfer than the very tip of it. So don't just buy a couple of them, try one of them, and go, "Oh, I didn't like it." Play with a little bit to figure out how to make it work for you. Is what I would suggest.
Right.
Let me ask you this: how long do you think a tip? How long do you replace your tips personally? How long does your tips last before you replace it?
It really depends how often you're using it, but if you're a casual user, you can last a year or more. If you're soldering every day, you maybe going to end up replacing it once a week, once every other week.
Wow.
If you're using it, say 40 hours a week, like in a production environment.
Yeah. No, I see. I understand now.
And a hobbyist, it could, a year or more,
and
as long as it's properly tinned.
And I wanted to touch on this because when I was buying $17 soldering irons from, China Specials, they typically come with really, really terrible quality tips. And I would wear them out in a couple months of pretty light soldering, all things considered. And ever since I started buying the one that I have on my bench that I do most of my work with is a Hacko. Ever since I started getting quality tips, I've been amazed at how long a quality tip will last. I'll go 6 months or a year and not have to replace it until I accidentally forget that I left it on overnight. and
Right.
Yeah, which is, by the way, a feature that your irons, I don't think all of them have, but some of them have the accelerometer in that, where they can turn themselves off and go to sleep if you set it down. Is that right?
Correct. The 9378 has that feature. So you can set a sleep timer in, you put it in its holder, it knows it's there, and if it's still for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, it'll put it to sleep.
Yeah.
So you're not going to leave it on overnight.
Yeah, and burn the tip. And that's a feature that the 9378. By the way, I should mention we're going to give away a 9378 at the end of this video. So stay tuned for that, for instructions on how to enter the giveaway. We gave one away in the last video. It was so popular we decided to do it again. But it's got that sleep timer, which is something that even the 9378. I'm looking at it now. It's $84 for the 9378 Pro. And you compare that to something like my Hacko 888D, which is like $120, and it doesn't have a sleep timer. So, there you go.
The other thing, the 9378 comes with an assortment of 10 tips also. So you get one installed and 9 extras, which will give you a variety of different sizes and shapes.
Yeah, and it looks like it also has does it have a spare heating element? Is that right?
It comes with a spare heating element.
Yeah.
Yep.
Nice. So yeah, if you are out there and you don't want to spend $85 or $100 on a well, I say a high end iron, but that's actually for a hobbyist that's high end. But
It's kind of high end for hobbyists. Yeah.
for soldering professionals wouldn't consider that to be high end, but that's not what we're talking about. If you want to spend only 20 or $30, I do actually recommend you check out the what's the 30? It's roughly $30. It's a 60-watt temperature controlled IEA iron.
Yeah,
What's the model?
it's a model 469,
Okay,
which is $29.99 with free shipping.
and I
It's
think
a
that
great iron.
I think that's actually the rock because I studied the whole line, and I think that's really the rock star of the line. The 9378 at $85. I think some people are going to look at that and go, well, it's got a lot of features. It's got the sleep timer. It's got the removable heating element. And they're going to go, that's the one for me. But I think that's a little bit more of a competitive price range. And some people are going to go a different direction. But I think down in like the $30 price range, that's a real rock star to get a $60, 60 watt temperature controlled iron. It's going to really help a lot of people out. But where I was going was, if you've got some $20 China special, the single biggest upgrade I think you can do on it is to put a good tip on it and upgrade the tip, and maybe you'll get good results out of even something like that. So, Randy, I think I think we've just about used up our time. I really want to thank you for being here and taking the time out of your busy schedule. Let's do the announcement for the giveaway, and also I want to plug your YouTube channel again. Link in the video description. SRA, I'm finally gonna have a place to point people when I want to give them good soldering tutorials and stuff. I'm sure there's a lot of. But I'm really happy that you guys are going to do this because I think you are a great educational resource. And, if you do the things in your channel that we're doing here, then it's going to be great. So, the giveaway, we're giving away, tell me again what we're giving away. It's the 9378 Pro.
9378 Pro
Awesome.
station.
Awesome. And
$83 or $84 value and great iron. A lot of features and 10 tips with it. So
Yeah.
it gives you a real good variety.
Yep. And the way to enter that is, like with all of my giveaways, to leave one comment down below in the video, in the comment section. Just one comment. If you leave more than one comment, that's more than one entry. That's not fair, and you'll be disqualified. I also want to warn you, I'm turning on comment moderation so that I don't see 1,000 notifications for every single comment that somebody leaves. So when you leave your comment, you will not see any comments down below. It's still there. Don't freak out. It's there. And also, if you like, hey, I left the first comment. No, you didn't. No, you didn't. You just don't see them. So no worries there. And I will post the announcement on the channel in a separate video. It'll be SRA Solder 9378 giveaway. And I'll put the winner's name in the video title so you can make sure you see it. Thank you so much for doing that, Randy. Thanks for giving that away. I very much appreciate that. Anything else we need to say before we sign off?
That's it. Just want to thank you for your time, and you gave us inspiration to start our own channel. So
Yeah.
appreciate everything you do for all the users out there.
Cool.
Very educational.
And you guys definitely check out srasolder.com. Again, link in the video description. A wide range of solder, flux, all kinds of soldering accessories, and of course, soldering irons as well. Thank you very much.
And if you want to recondition your tips, the sal ammoniac bar is a good choice.
And I know none of you guys know how to spell that, so we've got all that in the video description. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. Happy flying,
Very good.
everybody.